Hello, I'm really excited to be with you here today. My name is Basil Choudhry. I'm the Commercial Director of Mobilityways, which is part of the LiftShare Group. And today I'm going to be talking about building sustainable commutes. And we'll be looking at some of the work that Mobilityways has done over the last year with NHS trusts throughout the UK. And my aim is that that will help you see parallels with your organisation and maybe give you some insight into how you could go about making your commutes more sustainable. So let's get started. Let me tell you a little bit about us first. LiftShare Group's been going for 23 years, and for the bulk of that time, we've become the leader in car sharing in the UK. We have a free community of over 700,000 members, where members of the public can join up to share rides across the UK. But our commercial model for most of the last 2 decades has been helping large employers with their own branded LiftShare communities. And the main reason that employers want a LiftShare community is to help their teams find lift-sharing partners to share rides to work. Over that 2 decades, we've become real experts at decarbonising the commute. So when the pandemic hit, and suddenly a huge number of our customers didn't have a need to go on site, they were suddenly working from home, we decided to use that wealth of knowledge to start our sister brand, Mobilityways. Mobilityways is focused on making zero carbon commuting a reality. And what that means is that we help large employers to measure, reduce and report their carbon emissions from commuting. So why focus on the commute? It's certainly not something that gets a huge amount of attention. You know, we're very focused on certain areas of sustainability, and commuting doesn't really register in the general public. However, it's surprisingly important. It's a surprisingly high contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the UK. It's responsible for 5% of all emissions in the UK. 5% from commuting. And there are some really surprising statistics that come out of commuting when you really dig into the data. For instance, there are over 27 million people that commute in the UK. And whilst pre-pandemic, that might have been daily commuting, and now it might be a little bit more of a hybrid working arrangement, that's still 27 million people who regularly need to commute to a site. But shockingly, 24 million people drive alone on their commute. That's 24 million vehicles on the road with just one person in the vehicle. Not just causing congestion, but also greenhouse gas emissions. 10 million of those could share a lift, cycle, or walk. So now I'd like to show you a short video that we've made which shows why we believe making zero carbon commuting our reality should really matter.
We start with the stark findings of an international team of scientists led by the UK Met Office.
Today's report is yet more evidence that the growing concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is changing our climate. The reduction of Arctic sea ice cover and melting of the permafrost has accelerated during this year's heat wave.
Terrifying signs of things to come, according to tonight's dire new assessment from 13 federal agencies,
with potentially disastrous consequences for the planet. However, the last 3 months have seen some significant changes.
And this is the very last moment when we have in which we can actually hope to stem some of these disasters.
The vision for Mobilityways is to make zero carbon commuting a reality. And I created Mobilityways because it's just become really clear that unless we decarbonise the commute, we will fail our net zero goals. The commute is one of the least efficient journeys any of us ever make, and the commute has become the single largest source of emissions in the UK. It now accounts for 18 billion kilos of carbon every year. 90% of us travel alone to work every morning. 40% of us could cycle to work, but don't. 40% of us could go by public transport, but don't. 10 million of us could share a lift with someone who lives within walking distance of our house, but we don't share a lift. And yet we face a climate crisis. We need to decarbonise our commute, and there are solutions there right now that are not only better for the environment, but better for us, better for our pockets, better for our health. We need to change how we travel, and we've seen through the success of our sister brand LiftShare over the last 22 years that there are ways that we can shift behaviours, and it's proven to work, and we need to do it fast, because in reality we've only got 10 years to really start shifting the dial on this, and we've got to make a move now. If we fail to make zero carbon commuting a reality, we will fail our net zero goals. And if we fail our net zero goals, our children will not forgive us.
So I know it's a really evocative video, and hopefully it's really got you thinking about decarbonising the commute and why it matters. We made that video when we decided to make zero carbon commuting our company mission. But it's not just us who's really started thinking about decarbonising the commute as a priority. In the last few months, the central government has really zeroed in on this as a priority area. When the Department for Transport released their decarbonising transport plan a few months ago, for the first time, the UK central government pulled out commuting as a specific priority for decarbonisation. We're really grateful to have featured in that plan, in particular our ACEL, average commuter emissions level technology, was pinpointed as a case study in it. And we're really glad that what the government's coined Commute Zero is starting to take off. Because when the central government puts a weight behind something, of course that gets large organisations thinking about it and prioritising it. In fact, in the report, the government indicated that if we could reduce single occupancy commuting by 10%, that would have the potential to save 500,000 tonnes of CO2 a year. Which is ridiculous, isn't it? You know, when you think about numbers on that scale, it really is possible for us to make an impact. So why does this apply to the NHS specifically? The NHS is actually the world's first national health system to commit to net zero. And it's often easy, probably lazy, to think of the public sector as being behind the private sector when it comes to innovation and pushing forwards. However, what we've found at Mobilityways is that the NHS has been a real trailblazer in decarbonising the commute, really leading the way for not just the public sector, but the private sector as well. And when you think about the reasoning, it makes sense. Because as Simon Stevens, the chief executive of NHS England, says on this quote right here, the climate emergency is also a health emergency. And in that context, you really understand why it matters for the NHS to be leading the way in decarbonisation. When it comes specifically to commuting though, it really shows how forward-thinking the NHS is being. Because this is all the different sources of greenhouse gas emissions in the NHS. And internationally, emissions are split into scope 1, 2 and 3. Scope 1 and 2 being very direct sources of emissions, for instance, the power to run your facilities, the actual direct cost of running an organisation in greenhouse gas emissions terms. And then scope 3 emissions, which are often more indirect. Now, we actually believe that commuting should be a direct source of emissions, but internationally it's currently classed as scope 3. Scope 1 and 2 are the emissions that large employers are currently required to report on in their annual reports. And scope 3 is not yet mandatory, although there is clear signs of that changing, and internationally the Netherlands has recently made that change to require large employers to report on scope 3, and no doubt it will happen here in the UK in due course. If we look here at the scope 3 emissions in the NHS, there you'll see staff commuting, and you can see it's just one small piece of a huge puzzle. The NHS has been very forward-thinking because they've actually split their greenhouse emissions into what they call the NHS carbon footprint here, and then the NHS carbon footprint plus here, and commuting sits here. They've also, for the first time worldwide, gone that one step further and thought about something that actually sits outside of any international scope definitions, and started to consider patient and visitor travel as well. And when you look at the portion of the total picture that comes to commuting for the NHS specifically, their own analysis shows it's 4% staff commute. So you see there's great swathes of their emission which come from their wider supply chain, from medicines, from equipment manufacturing. Then you've got the more standard building energy and waste and water here. So why is the NHS focusing on the commute? Well, of course, the truth is that they're not just focusing on the commute. They're focusing on across the board decarbonisation. And even though there are big chunks of emissions elsewhere, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't focus on those smaller contributors. And 4% of total emissions is still huge. In fact, a lot of the work they've been doing over the last couple of decades has been focused on the low-hanging fruit. So if you look at the benchmark of 1990 that's used internally at NHS, and then you see the progress to 2020, you'll see that there's been a 62% reduction on that core NHS carbon footprint. But there's only been a 26% reduction in the footprint plus. And that's because the easiest, simplest things have been done. Switching to renewable power, putting in energy-saving light bulbs, putting in more efficient boilers. And now it's the time for the NHS to start looking at their supply chain, the longer tail of emissions, and doing the work they've done over the last 2 decades on their core emissions for that footprint plus. So what are the real issues with so-called Scope 3 emissions? Why is it harder to understand, deal and reduce than it is with Scope 2 and Scope 1? Well, these are a few common things that we hear from organisations across the UK. It's difficult to measure Scope 3 emissions. It's not as easy as putting an electricity meter in and just monitoring your usage. It's more complicated than that. For commuter emissions, you have to understand how your staff are choosing to get to work on any given day to really understand it. Reduction is hard because it's not just a case of saying, yes, we will pay the bill to install energy efficient lighting. Actually, you have to do behavioural change with your staff and your teams, and that's not easy. And then reporting is difficult because there's often not standardisation for Scope 3. Different countries, different organisations reporting and calculating in a variety of different ways. But it's really important, and this has been something that we've found to be really true in the NHS. It's really important to not just look at the sustainability benefits. To get buy-in across an organisation, it's really important to also look at the non-sustainability benefits. So for zero carbon commuting and the work we do with clients, there's often very direct benefits to the organisation and employees. For example, in the NHS, there is still huge demands on parking. And decreasing the number of single occupancy vehicles on site not only reduces greenhouse gas emissions, but also reduces demands on their facilities. A huge number of the trusts that we've been working with also have acute problems due to building works, taking over and further reducing temporarily their parking spaces. And one of the things that we've really been helping trusts with through our analysis and our reporting is showing the gaps between provision and need. The NHS has got shifts working through the night, through weekends, and often there's a real discrepancy between the public transport provision and the requirement. And so by doing deep analysis on sustainable commuting, it's possible to help them understand what they need to do with their local transport providers to improve provision. So Mobilityways, in brief, what we do is we're a software platform that helps large employers to measure, reduce and report on their greenhouse gas emissions from commuting. And we have a range of different modules and tools that make that possible. And I'm just going to give you a small insight into a couple of those in the context of the NHS. So let's start with ASIL. ASIL is the average commuter emissions level. And what we've done is we've made a really lightweight system using government data sources that allows us to give a benchmarking score to an organisation for their greenhouse gas emissions. This lets them see how they're performing now and also allows them to track their reductions over time as they make interventions and try to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. It also allows, and this is really important in the context of the NHS, which is made up of hundreds of different organisations, it allows them to benchmark it off each other and compare their results and their progress. So let's take a little look at how ASIL can be so powerful. This here is a trust that we've been working with, and this is their genuine set of ASIL results. Pre-pandemic, they had an ASIL of 650. So what does that mean? That means 650 kilograms of CO2e emissions per year per employee. That's against a UK average of 601. So you can see they're just above the UK average for emissions from commuting pre-pandemic. During the pandemic, now, they've seen a big reduction in their ASIL. It's gone down to 597. And of course, we can all guess why that might be the case. If I look at their travel survey data, we can see that the pre-pandemic line in the turquoise versus the magenta now line, you can see the changes. Obviously, working from home, they had non-pre-pandemic and it shot up to 10% now. And that's responsible for a huge amount of decrease in commuter emissions. But when you zoom in on those result sets, there's a bigger story. And this is why doing the data analysis is so important. For instance, you can see that we've seen a small reduction in single occupancy vehicles pre-pandemic to now. However, we've seen an equal decrease in cyclists coming down. And we've also seen a small increase in walking. We've seen a big drop off in bus utilisation. And you've got to start asking yourself in your organisational context, what is that shift and why is that happening? And simply put, in this organisation's context, when you do a deep analysis of the results, what you find is that a lot of the staff that are able to work from home are administrative, not medical staff, for example. And they happen to live closer to the organisation. We're more willing to take public transport, to walk or cycle. And so the pandemic shift to working from home hasn't impacted the single occupancy vehicles of people travelling from further afield. It's impacted more the people that live locally. And we've done some further analysis using our next tool, Scoping Smart Mobility. What Scoping Smart Mobility does is we take the anonymous postcodes of employees and we map those against the real world provision available to them. So we see if there's a sustainable public transport option, if it's viable in the real world for them to walk or cycle. And then we do some top level analysis for the whole employee base. And for that same trust and that same location, you can find an incredible 63% had a viable public transport route. And incredibly, 59% could cycle to work and 26% could walk. And this is why it's really important to do it specifically for each trust, because this is quite unusual. Normally, when we do this sort of analysis, we see much lower cycling and walking potential, especially for hospitals that are out of town, on the outskirts of towns. But for this organisation, it would be possible for a quarter of their workforce to walk and 60% to cycle. Well, when we look back again at the travel survey results, either pre-pandemic or during the pandemic, you'll see that what they're actually achieving is nothing like that. If 60% can actually cycle, we've only got 10% doing it. And if 30% could walk, we've got half of that doing it. So you can see this organisation has real potential to massively scale back their single occupancy vehicle usage. The reason why you have to do the analysis for each specific organisation is because the results really do differ depending on where their exact staff are coming from and the context of the public transport in their area. And our scoping smart mobility looks at the real world potential. So for example, when we look for this organisation at public transport, it turns out that almost 80% could take public transport physically to get to the site of the hospital. But that would take 4 times the time duration of that commute if they were to travel by single occupancy vehicle. And our own work over the last 2 decades has shown that people are willing to take a commute by public transport if it's up to twice the length of time of a single occupancy vehicle. So that means that walking from their home to the bus stop, waiting for the bus, taking the bus, walking the other side, or walking to the train station, taking the train, they're willing for that total journey to be up to twice the length of if they hopped in their car and drove directly. And that's 63% in this hospital's case. So 63% of their workforce could take a viable public transport route. And at the moment, 50% are driving by themselves in the car. That's a huge opportunity for promotion, for impact, and for behaviour change. They've got this work has really shown this hospital the art of the possible. So what I'd like to do now is show you a video case study from one of the trusts we've been working with. This is a Scottish trust, NHS Lanarkshire, and you'll see how some of this all comes together from their own mouths.
NHS Lanarkshire has over 600,000 residents that we serve. We have over 12,000 staff working in a range of 3 large acute hospitals and community sites as well. As we've seen from the commentary surrounding COP26, we need systemic and quite full change across all boards in Scotland, across all governments as well, in order to reach net zero. Obviously, commuting has a huge impact on that, particularly when we consider staff and patient travel as well, which can't be overlooked. Some of those journeys will be essential, but we need to make sure as an organisation that we do that in the most sustainable fashion. ACEL and scoping has been really useful in actually just putting a metric to emissions from staff commuting. It's insight that we didn't have before, but it's allowed us to have that figure to then track and manage over time. It also shows us where staff are commuting from and to. It allows us to then target strategically what sites we go after. Staff travel surveys have been interesting because it showed overwhelmingly that any staff journeys made have been via single occupancy car journey, which I think underlines the importance of what we're trying to achieve. As an organisation, we need to be able to communicate what we're doing, what facilities and resources are available to staff to make small changes in workplace that can add up over time. Some of the initiatives we've put in place to encourage staff to commute more sustainably have been some cycle parking, cycling infrastructure across our 3 large acute sites. We've also seen cycling infrastructure go into our community sites as well. That includes bike repair stands, cycle stands, heated tunnel rails. We have plans to install more of those. I think one of the main benefits staff experience through Mobilityways is the personalised travel plans. That's a huge benefit. It's never something we've been able to offer. Having that sort of automated through the platform is a huge benefit. Even speaking to the staff, I've heard many benefits from just improved mental health. They're getting to work refreshed, ready for the day. I would recommend Mobilityways as a tool for all public bodies. It's a level of insight we've never had before. We're still quite early in that journey on Mobilityways as a platform, but even still it's been worth its weight in gold. I'm optimistic we can achieve zero carbon commuting. It won't be without its challenges, but there is a real appetite out there. We just need to be able to leverage that and deliver that.
It's fantastic to hear from Michael at NHS Lanarkshire how well the project's been going so far. But in truth, we're really just at the start of our journey with NHS Lanarkshire. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions to zero is not a short-term game. It's something that requires real focus over many years, and it's about building upon ever greater increases in sustainable commuting. To pull it all together, as I sort of finish up here my time with you today, I'd like to just talk a little bit about our Mobilityways dashboard. This is the central tool which shows an organisation their sustainable commuting picture. It pulls together their travel survey results, their ASIL data, their ASIL impact over time. It allows them to see and analyse their scoping data, but it also helps them to send out personal travel plans to their team. The Mobilityways platform is the tool that helps large employers to measure, reduce and report on their emissions from commuting. And if you'd like to know about any of the specific modules that we have, if you'd like to learn a little bit more about anything I've talked about today, then please do get in touch. Drop us a line, team@mobilityways.com, and we'd love to answer your questions and talk you through anything in more detail. We've been working across this last year with a huge number of organisations on really setting out their decarbonisation plans for commuting. That's across the public sector and the private sector, and hopefully what I've done today is just give you some insights from our work with the NHS that really can apply to your organisation. Thank you.